So a warm welcome on this surprisingly beautiful evening to this discussion of authoritarianism and eternal recurrence. I'm Debarati Sanyal, Faculty Director of the Center for Interdisciplinary Critical Inquiry, otherwise and affectionately known as CC. We support the programs in critical theory, environmental arts and humanities, the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion, and a number of grant-based initiatives, including most recently the Psychedelic Society and Culture Grant. Before I introduce this event, let me signal a related event on February 10th at BATFA titled Imagining Beyond Authoritarianism, Race and Gender in Our Times, and you have little announcements and posters there. And this features Berkeley colleagues and Bay Area artists, and there's a linked event on February 13th called Beyond the Authoritarian Imaginary at David Brower Center with Angela Davis and Isaac Gilliam. These two CC, ICCTP Mellon-funded events focus on the role of the arts in mobilizing a powerful counter-imaginary against contemporary US authoritarianism and its ideals of whiteness, patriarchy, and biological reductionism, among other terrible things. So in some sense, they'll be exploring the possibilities of artistic responses to this afternoon's historical and analytic diagnoses. We're really grateful to Critical Theory for hosting Ilya Matveev and Ilya Budrytskis as visiting scholars. It's been a real gift to us at Berkeley. Alas, Ilya Matveev is at home with a mysterious 5-letter ailment. But let's thank him as well as Georgi Popovich from Slavic, since both were crucial to organizing this event. And thanks to all the participants who are going to be introduced shortly. And a special thanks to CC manager and staff, manager Victoria Jashob, Patty Dunlap, and JD Hoyt. None of this would ever happen without you. The question of authoritarianism is sadly all too timely. The title of the panel, Fascism, an Eternal Recurrence, asks us if the phenomenon has ever been untimely, or if in fact it has been an eternal recurrence all along, like the cyclical cosmology of thinkers such as Blanqui, Baudelaire, and Nietzsche that Walter Benjamin turned to as he wrote about the possibility of awakening from eternal recurrence and releasing the new. Was authoritarianism ever an occurrence before becoming a recurrence, a tragedy before becoming farce? Is the repetition of this catastrophe identical across histories and geographies, under the French Second Empire, under Stalin or Mussolini, under Putin, Modi, Netanyahu, or Xi Jinping today? What is new in the deployment of authoritarian power in relation to new technologies of surveillance and capture, neoliberal governance, demographic agendas, phantasms of race, gender, or sexuality? What are historical and geopolitical continuities between authoritarianisms? And are these partial and modified reinscriptions or even ruptures? I imagine these and other questions will be addressed in our panel today, which will be moderated by Aglaya Glebova from History of Art and the author of the fabulous Alexander Rodchenko Photography in the Time of Stalin, which came out with you last year. Yes. So to you, Aglaya.
Thank you, Debarati. And see, just also want to thank the Center for the Interdisciplinary Critical Inquiry, Languages and Literatures, and the Program in Critical Theory for their support of this event. And I'm going to briefly introduce this event, Fascism and Eternal Recurrence, ? This is a question, as Debarati beautifully illuminated for us. And then I will introduce briefly our 4 speakers. Sadly, Ilya Matveev cannot be here, but our 4 speakers, Ilya Budrytskis, Blanca Nessay, Dylan Riley, and Alexei Yurchak. Fascism, an Eternal Recurrence, considers the return of returned fascism to our contemporary political vocabulary, a term often applied to modern authoritarian regimes and right-wing populist movements. Moving away from historical analogies, today's presenters turn to the nature of the current global crisis of representative democracy and the neoliberal social model, considering questions such as, what does fascism mean today? Is it a concept applicable only to the events of the 20th century, or a universal category that remains relevant? What features of global capitalism and market society is it connected with? How relevant are the definitions we find in literature in 20th century fascism for modern times? And what is the relationship? Oh, that's not, no. I'm just going to project. How's that? All right. And what is the relationship between ideology, mass movements, and the nature of political regimes that defines fascism in our historic present? I will introduce our speakers all at once so that we don't have to break between presentations for introductions. And I will introduce them in the order in which they will speak. First Dylan, then Blanca, then Alexei, and then Ilya. And each presenter will speak for about 10 minutes, followed by a half-hour roundtable format discussion, and then we'll take Q&A from the audience. First speaker today, Dylan Riley, is professor of sociology at the University of California, Berkeley. He studies capitalism, socialism, democracy, authoritarianism, and knowledge regimes in comparative and historical perspective. He has authored and co-authored 6 books, including The Civic Foundations of Fascism in Europe, Italy, Spain, and Romania, 1870 to 1945, and most recently, Microverses, Observations from a Shattered Present, out with Verso, and I think soon to appear, also with Verso Perdita on loss. His most recent work has focused on the relationship between democracy and capitalism, particularly in its current phase. And his writing on this topic has appeared in the New Left Review, The Nation, and the New Statesman. Blanca Misset is Associate Professor of French in the Modern Languages and Literatures Department at San Francisco State University. They specialize in the Enlightenment, 18th century French literature, Francophone literature and culture, 18th through 20th century French and European philosophy, as well as Marxism and feminist theory. Their recent publications include, among others, articles on Diderot's materialist aesthetics, social reproduction in Marx and Fourier, and 1930s Marxist debates on Ethiopian and Chinese national liberation wars, in journals such as 18th Century Theory and Interpretation and Cahiers Philosophiques, as well as essays that seek to reconceptualize the question of academic freedom, one that was just published in the journal Theory and Event. And Blanca is also a member of California Scholars for Academic Freedom. Alexei Yurchak is professor of anthropology and affiliate member in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures at Berkeley. His interests and areas of expertise include Soviet history and the processes of post-socialist transformation in the former Soviet Europe. I should not be the person making that phrase, but in the former Soviet Union and Western Europe, political institutions and ideologies in Soviet and post-Soviet Russia, political philosophy and language philosophy, and the interface between language discourse and power, as well as visual anthropology. His book, Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More, The Last Soviet Generation, received the 2007 Language Image Book Award, as well as the 2015 Enlightener Prize for the Russian version that Alexei actually rewrote. He is completing a book tentatively entitled Bodies of Lenin, Genealogies of Sovereign Flesh. Ilya Budraitskis is visiting scholar in the program in critical theory at Berkeley. He is a political philosopher, historian, and cultural and political activist. Until Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, he had taught political philosophy and cultural theory at Moscow School of Social and Economic Sciences and the Moscow Institute of Contemporary Art, and he also served on the board of Moscow's Sakharov Center. His publications include Dissidents Among Dissidents, Ideology, Politics, and the Left in Post-Soviet Russia, which came out in English in 2022 with Verso. And in Russia, the book received the highly prestigious Andrei Bely Prize. With Ilya Matveyev, who sadly can't be here today, Ilya Budraitskis is currently completing a book tentatively entitled The Post-Fascist Condition. No, we changed that, I'm sorry. Yeah. We discussed this right before. Yeah. Can you remind me the new title?
New Russian imperialism, capital, and ideology.
On that note, Dylan, I'm going to welcome you to the podium.
Well, thanks very much for that introduction, and thanks to you all for being here. I'm basically going to give just a very, very brief and schematic overview of some of my thinking about this issue of whether we should think about the contemporary moment with the category of fascism or not. I want to say, I guess by way of preface to what I'm going to be talking about, I want to say that I think that we are all in agreement that whatever we want to call contemporary democracy, capitalist democracy, representative, like whatever it is, I think we're in agreement, and it would certainly be my position that this isn't a profound structural crisis on a global scale, and that this crisis is extremely serious. So I'll be saying some things about fascism, but I am not, and they may strike people as somehow trying to diminish the severity of the crisis that we're living through, but that's not at all my intention. Just basically trying to get some analytic clarity on how to think about the contemporary moment. And so I'm going to kind of pose a question about, what the most useful analytic category here is: fascism, or what I'll be calling neo-Bonapartism, something I've written about in different kinds of contexts. So I just wanted to basically these, three basic things, and then conclude, just asking this question, what is fascism? And I'm going to give it just incredibly crude, historical data, referring to the fascisms of the interwar period, that period from 1918 to 1945, or what we call classic fascism. And the remarks I'll make are mostly applicable to, I suppose, although not exclusively. So, what's happening today? What's the best concept? Conclusion. Simple. Okay, I'm a very kind of crude and simple person, so you'll have to forgive me of that. I don't have the range of reference of humanists, and I don't pretend to, so I apologize. Okay, so what is this business about fascism? So I'm just going to say a couple of things about it. I think, and this is a somewhat controversial idea, although I think it's not controversial when you think about it like this. Fascist regimes were what I would have termed forms of authoritarian democracies. These are the fascists in the world. They were characterized by mass mobilizing, autocratically run party organizations that explicitly replaced elections and parliament as the main institutional basis for the construction of the popular will. So, particularly if you read doctrinal literature, for example, Italian fascism, and also sort of what I would call fascist adjacent thinkers, Carl Schmitt perhaps being the most important one, it's extremely important to understand that in fascist doctrine and ideology, there is a contraposition between democracy and liberalism. And fascism sort of intellectually hinges on opposition between these two things, and its fundamental kind of doctrinal justification in some sense is that the fascist party is a more authentic expression of the popular will than is the corrupt electoral procedure of parliament. So in that sense, what we see, we can think about fascist regimes as authoritarian. I think there were two broad sort of conditions under which such regimes emerged, and just very briefly to sketch them out. First, domestic context, I think, was characterized by an historically quite specific syndrome in which the sort of domestic bourgeoisie was politically weak, lacked its own mass mobilizing party organization, and was facing at the same time a socialist party which was either really or incipiently revolutionary. So that's the first domestic condition. And then the second, I would say, kind of geopolitical condition is a struggle for hegemony in the context of the decline, basically, of British hegemony in the period after the First World War. And of course, the fascism, in a sense, was if it was characterized by anything, you could say it's characterized by a kind of attempt at a geopolitical level. The idea of the proletarian nation. So under these conditions, fascist parties attempted to politically organize their local capitalist classes and to challenge, to overthrow the existing system of international relations. How much time has gone? So I think if we think about the contemporary period, it's just the nature of the political crisis is different from what it was in the interwar period. And it's different in the sense that it's simply not the case that capital faces a threat from below. It faces no such threat anywhere. However, right, and this would be my main point, it does face a threat which is internal to itself in many ways. And that threat has to do with the basic problem or syndrome of the capitalist world economy, really since 1980, but increasing since 2008. And that problem being slow growth, slow investment, economic, you could say, just a lack of economic dynamism on a global scale. And this is something I've worked on a bit, obviously with Robert Brenner in the context of the New York Review. That creates problems, I think, both domestically, but perhaps more relevantly today, it creates problems geopolitically. Because I think that the exhaustion of neoliberalism in a geopolitical sense is manifested in one way as an exhaustion of the possibility of a developmental model. And I would sort of hypothesize that the fundamental political problem that I think you could say, and I would be very interested to see what the panelists say, the fundamental political problem that Putin is facing, in a sense, is the fact that neoliberalism does offer Russia the status of a second or third rate power and nothing more. And that, in a sense, the geopolitical overreach that we saw beginning, well, earlier, but most obviously manifested in February 24th, 2022, is in some sense a kind of compensation. I'm sure there are psychological and ideological dimensions. Just some, brief empirical evidence on this. If you look at world, GDP growth over the last 50, 70 years or so, this might seem like a very noisy line, but it's not really. If you look at those dips, every recession after recession, but the trough is deeper, the recovery shallower. This is going right up until the COVID recession. And we now see there's obviously a wide variety of thinkers who are writing about this global deceleration. And of course, those of you who have looked at Robert Gordon's graph of annual growth and total factor productivity, you'll see kind of the same story. It's just kind of some justification. So I think this is I think it's a very profound crisis of capitalist democracy. I think that capitalist democracy historically has been based on the idea of an expanding pie that allowed for a class compromise between labor and capital. I think to a certain extent, this mechanism has unraveled, but it is unraveled in a peculiar way because there is very little pressure from below for labor. So we have a kind of crisis of legitimacy, but in a context in which there is very little pressure from below. So then the question is, what do we do with this weird syndrome? Well, in one sense, I just want to say that I think, like the period of the interwar period, I do in fact think we are in a period of kind of hegemonic crisis. This is something that, of course, is a controversial statement to a certain extent. But the idea basically is that politically, there is a problem, and politically, particularly, there is a problem in our era of representative democracy and its basic legitimacy, right? And there's also a problem geopolitically. It is no longer the case that the geopolitical order is coherently organized around hegemon and follower in the following way. That is to say, in the sense that it was so organized in the period after 1950, when you could say that the particular interests of the US capitalist class were in fact in the general interests of capital as a whole, manifested most clearly in the willingness of that capitalist class to open its vast continental market to goods produced in Europe thereby propelling European growth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This sort of mechanism is no longer working. One must be struck by the increasingly zero-sum beggar-thy-neighbor policies that characterize even the advanced capitalist countries. So there is this geopolitical crisis as well as a domestic crisis of legitimacy. But no party. Why no party? Because the fascist parties were produced very much as imitations of the revolutionary socialist strap. We do not have that kind of thing, and the organizational pressures, therefore, that produce that kind of mass mobilizing energy simply aren't there. What you get instead, I think, is a variety of highly particular individual figures who emerged apparently everywhere, right? Bolsonaro and Trump and Putin, these are incredibly different, all very, very rooted in the particularities of their individual countries. Now, why this, in a sense, then, this is a total contrast to the interwar period, where you saw a convergence on different types of authoritarians. They all kind of had uniforms and a similar kind of ideology. But what we have to understand, I think, in the current period is a kind of particularization in which every country produces a leader that somehow sort of expresses the particularities of that particular political tradition. And the reason for that is because I think we basically are talking about a crisis of hegemony in the absence of pressure from below, in the absence of the kinds of pressures that would homogenize or internationalize the forms of authoritarianism that we are witnessing today. Okay, so that's my proposal, and really looking forward to the radically different views of the other panelists. Thanks very much. You're not gonna right?
I would like to start by saying that we are sitting on the Puchun territory, which is the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people. And the reason why we do land acknowledgements is because we want to recognize that the community here at Berkeley is benefiting from this land. And we also want to call on the University of California to be held accountable to the rights and the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples here in the US, but also I think today, especially abroad, given that the people of Palestine are being slaughtered with our taxes. So I would like to talk about the endurance, growth, and mutations of the far right in France, and I will be speaking specifically about one party, which is the Front National. And I don't have the breadth of doing a macro analysis like Dylan just did, but I think maybe going through the example of one organization and how it has changed in the last 20 years might be helpful for this discussion. So the Front National was created in 1972, and it came out of the most traditional fascist movement, which is Action Française and Marat. So we could say that it has a fascist origin. Even its symbol is borrowed from the Italian fascist movement, the MSI. And the party changed its name in 2018. It became Rassemblement National. It was a result of a series of transformations that we'll try to go through quickly, mainly when Marine Le Pen took over the party in 2011 and started a series of changes. I just compiled a little bit the growth of the party and some of the growth of its electoral results in France. So as we see in the 70s, it's pretty insignificant. There is a growth starting in the 80s, and there's a first peak in 95 with Jean-Marie Le Pen as a candidate coming fourth to the elections, 15% of the vote. Then there was a crisis. I will not go into the crisis. The FN split between the FN and MNR. 60% of the membership of the FN went with the other group, but the other group collapsed. And then there was this kind of weird thing that happened in 2002 that traumatized most of French people, which is that Jean-Marie Le Pen arrived second to the first round of the election. So there was a big like sursaut démocratique, everybody saying, oh my God, we the French, we cannot have fascism in power. And so there was a big rallying against him. He was defeated. He only got 17% of the vote. But actually what folks thought was an exception became kind of the new normal in France. So we see a slow growth of the party in 2007, but actually the big jumps will happen after 2012. Marine Le Pen already took control of the party, and the two last elections, 2017 and 2022, we had again the Front National arriving second and then getting to the second round. And the last election, there was actually two big candidates, Le Pen and Zemmour. So you put all the two together. And the second round, Le Pen got 41% of the vote. So that's, I will try to go through some of the factors and evolutions of this party, because it's not about only explaining what happened, but also what happened to the Front National to grow and also become penetrating the institutions of bourgeois democracy. So if we were to explain the growth of the FN in 2002, there's several factors, and I think Dylan covered them. There is instability of the capitalist system. There was a recession in 75, very slow growth in the 80s, France barely growing. That was really new for French economy. And then a new recession in 92, 93, which was one of the European Union. There's also a growing dissatisfaction with popular and middle classes with the policies of the bipartisan system there, so the UMP or the Socialist Party, because of feeling that the economic policy ends up being very similar. There's an erosion of this system of governance that starts to happen all over Europe. So in this sense, we've seen this in Spain, in Italy, in many other places. And there is also a decay of the distinct role and influence of French internationally, right? France has to block with the European Union. So, it loses kind of its independent standing through the fusion with the European Union and also its role with NATO. Also around this moment, there is something what we can trace as a rise or an emergence of white nationalism in France. It is a return to, it's ethno-nationalism. So it goes back to biological, eugenic understandings of race. They're presented as new, but they're not very new. And what this group tries to do, and Alain de Benoit is one of them, is basically trying to find a new ideological base for the far right or the fascist movement to grow, because the more traditional fascist movement had recruited from elements of society that maybe are not so prominent in France today, like Catholics or royalists, right? So it wasn't much tied to kind of old ideology. So there's an attempt to renew this ideology, make it very appealing. And of course, borrowing the trope of the internal enemy and this theory of the big déplacement, the big replacement, the idea that France is being colonized through immigration and it needs to go back to its origins. So there is a big explosion of Islamophobic, neo-colonial and xenophobic ideas. Now, something that is important for us is that these ideas that might seem extreme became slowly normalized in French public discourse. And if you talk to everybody, it seems like what is the right, everything is moving. The target post is moving. And the argument was of the establishment right that the best way to combat the far right was to give responses to the arguments and the talking points of the right, right? So then it was Sarkozy first who did that in 2007, with creating a ministry or a secretary of national identity. It's kind of a weird thing, an institution that is going to define what national identity is linked to immigration. So there was a big blowback, but that was not the end of it. In 2015, François Hollande, the socialist president, decided to strip naturalized and binational citizens of French nationality if they were accused of terrorism, implicitly saying that there were two kinds of French citizens, so those who could be stripped of nationality, those who could not. And the most recent thing is, of course, the big debate in France, which is the immigration law that was passed by Macron, which puts into law one of the big principles the Front National has been fighting for, which 20 years ago was unimaginable, that there will be national preferences will be instituted in law, meaning that French citizens will have rights and better rights and different rights than non-French citizens. And so that is happening in France. So those are some of the posters of the Front National, and we see the very Islamophobic, racist, ideology that this party put forward. But I want to go now through the elections that allow the Front National and Marine Le Pen to grow its popularity, grow its electoral base, and become today, it seems like a possible new president for France in the new election. So when Marine Le Pen takes control of the party, she starts fighting with her father, who was a previous boss of the party, Jean-Marie Le Pen, because he's doing publicly expressing what most of the members being very openly, very anti-Semitic, very racist. That is not helping the Front National grow. She expels the father from the party. She changes the name of the party to Rassemblement National, and she says our party is not a fascist party, we're not a far-right party, we're just a national right party. So it tries to position itself outside of the far-right and fascist discourse. And it starts focusing more on economic issues. So actually it changes its program. Before it embraced more neoliberal policies, and it changes to more protectionist and patriotic policies. It also stops opposing the advances in social rights in the way the previous fascist movement or far-right movement did it. So it becomes ambiguous on abortion rights, on gay marriage, does not fully acquiesce, of course, but it's not the central part of its discourse. And it purges formally the party of the most extreme elements. And something very important Marine Le Pen is going to do, she's going to reappropriate the feminine symbols of the Republic. In the first period is Jeanne d'Arc, and it's more like a warrior and aggressive, and that's more in tune with the traditional far-right and fascist movement, because there's this component of a counter-revolution or revolution. And she switches to Marianne, which is the mother of the Republic, right? And so if we see the posters of the last election, 2022, we can see that Marine Le Pen appears as a loving mother of the nation, right? She's returning to French people their money. She's giving back. She's returning to French people their country. These are the two choices that were presented: Choisir la France, to choose France, or Ensemble la France, France together. There's also a poster about freedom, and the most important one was, of course, Marine Présidente, Femme d'État, Women of State, right? So I want to talk now about the developments of this last election and finish with some questions, provocative questions for us. This last election saw new changes in the Front National. First, the electoral base, of course, increased because we have more votes, but it increased especially in the middle classes and some sectors of the ruling elites and political elites. That is to say, the percentage of the popular vote decreased and the percentage of the middle and upper middle classes increased. The second is that she attempted very clearly to embrace the populist discourse and the government by referenda. That was one of the results of the Gilets Jaunes movement, and one of the proposals was to be able to do, like we have here, propositions where you gather signatures and you can make laws. And she sought to establish a broader connection with the popular classes by becoming suddenly a defender of public social services, talking about she was opposed to the retirement pension. She was against the strikes, of course, because they hate unions, but she was criticizing the government against the pension reform. She's defending the healthcare system. She's saying why the government is not investing in public services. And of course, in her view, what she defends is a social nativism. That is, we need good public services, we need a welfare state. So it's kind of like competing and borrowing the planks of the left, but only for the French, right? We don't want to spend money on the non-French subjects. And the last element, which is the one I think I'm gonna, that should make us reflect, is in this process of winning more and more votes, now being de facto the second, people know she's gonna be again in the second round. She's appealing more to power. She seems like a more presidential candidate. And a lot of the Front National deputies are not taking public roles from the city councils and out to the assembly. So today there are 89 deputies in the parliament. That's a big jump from the last election, where you only had 8. And actually Macron could not rule today without the votes of the Front National. So Macron can make all of these laws today because he has 2 other right parties that vote for him. So Le Pen's party went from being, you know, the anti-system to this very clear switch that we want to become a government party, and now is the party that allows Macron to stay in power, right? And that's important to know. So some provocative questions for us. One is that many critics now are speaking of a notabilisation, like an establishment process of the Rassemblement National, because 50% of the candidates at the last election come from the upper middle classes. And so, you know, for a party that comes being anti-establishment, anti-elites, a renewal of France, it is kind of like becoming more maybe a new establishment, right? It's no different than the other parties. And I think what Dylan said about the absence of these mass parties, of new models of parties, like the Front National is acting more and more like any other political force. The institutionalization of the far right went hand in hand with the absorption of key elements of its flanks by the majority of the political forces. So, as I said before, one part of its program, which was this adoption of this internal enemy, this hatred of immigration, this association with immigration, and problems of security, etc., has become normalized discourse. So one question we could ask is, who has changed who, right? Like, the party has changed the system, has adapted to the system, and the rest of the parties, right? So there's kind of a reciprocal relation, which I'm not saying by any means that Rassemblement National is not a dangerous political force. I'm just having us reflect on the fact that the way Le Pen campaigned now and after the adoption of the immigration law, it says, well, now Macron is using our language, he's applying our law, so at the next election, vote for the original, not for the copy, right? If the rest of the parties are doing our policy, vote for us because this is our politics. So then it seems like it has become de facto an establishment party that does not challenge much the status quo. I think the last point, though, I think might be the biggest point of tension or conundrum for these parties, which is what it has to do with what Dina was saying about the difficulty, for example, of Russia today, of expanding its imperialist power and being able to compete today with the US and China. France is in the same situation. The French government was very hit by the fact that they lost the political military presence in Burkina Faso, in Mali, in Central Africa, and in Niger. The rise of inter-imperial rivalry does not leave too much space for France. And then you have Le Pen, who has a similar discourse that Trump today, which they are non-interventionist, against wars, against like expanding abroad. They just want to recenter in France. You know, their argument is we should not be, it's not our business to be in it. And so it's the same dilemma the Republican Party has today, opposing funding for the war. But yeah, okay, you don't want to do that, but then how can you fight for hegemony if you're not deploying the full force of the state abroad, right? And the Republicans are now in this historical crisis never imagined before, where half of their leadership is kind of changing the principles it was funded on, like expansion, imperialist expansion. So, and this in France is compounded with the complicated relation with the European Union, and I will finish with that. The Front National gained a lot of popularity in its growth in the early 2000s, opposing neoliberalism, the European Union. France voted down in the referendum the adoption of the constitution. That was a big surprise in 2007. And the main parties campaigning against the European Union constitution were the far right and the far left. And in the last years, Le Pen has toned down its program. It used to be, we will exit the European Union, we will break with the European Union, we will do like a Frexit. And now they're not saying that anymore. They're saying we can work within the European Union. We just need to establish the preference of French law over European law. So there's also like a tension there for the French imperialist project. So I'll end it here, and I'm really looking forward to
I wanted to think about the Putin's regime from the point of view of fascism. Is it fascist? Is it not? Whether that kind of terminology applies today. And I think it does, especially since the beginning of the war, which was in February 2022, almost 2 years ago. There's been a mutation in the regime. And at the same time, it's an interesting kind of question, because as some people say, like Grigori Yudin, for example, sociologist who I know, would say that the regime is fascist, but the society is not. And there's an interesting dynamic here. For example, it's very well known that the Russian soldiers in Ukraine have no concern for their civilian lives. It's a very brutal war, but there's nothing comparable direct against ethnic Ukrainians in Russia. There's no such position. There's nothing comparable to that in Russia itself. There's no ethnic mobilization against ethnic Ukrainians. That's just not the case. So it's not that kind of fascist mutation. So I wanted to look very carefully at what happened to actual narratives of the regime, how it talks about the war, how it conceptualizes it. And as a result, I looked at a lot of statements by Putin and his entourage, but that required me to be very close to the actual quotes, and so I had to write my paper. I cannot really render those quotes in my own words. So apologies to my fellow panelists, I will have to read. I will not just be talking like you did in free flow, which I wish I did, but I can't. Okay, Putin is not a coherent system of ideas and values. Unlike the Soviet Union, Putin's regime is not trying to build a clearly articulated future. The propositions that regime puts forward are not prescriptive, but reactive, I would say. They don't lay out a long-term plan of action, but react to the actions that have already taken place. This approach has helped the regime to reproduce itself, but along the way, it's also contributed to a fascist mutation of the regime's political project. I will consider how Putin and his entourage have articulated the goals of the military invasion in Ukraine and how these goals have changed over time. Tracing this genealogy of goals provides one with a glimpse of the internal transformation of the regime since February 2022. So on February 24th, 2022, as well known, having ordered the invasion of Ukraine, Putin described his two goals as first, the protection of the people of Donbass from the genocide of the Kiev regime, and second, the denazification of Ukraine. Denazification was an unfamiliar word, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs Lavrov had to explain that it meant allowing Ukrainians to, I'm quoting, to determine their future by defeating the illegal Nazi regime that oppressed them, unquote. But 1 week into the operation, and after the failed attempts to take Kiev, the goal changed. Now it was to protect Russia from what Putin called anti-Russia, either the whole of Ukraine or some enclave inside it, which, I'm quoting, has been created near our borders and continued to threaten us, including with nuclear weapons, unquote. A few days later, Putin added, quote, there is every reason to believe that in the immediate vicinity of Russia, on the territory of Ukraine, components of biological weapons were created. We were left with no option to peacefully resolve this situation, unquote. The original goal of denazification as regime change was disavowed. Putin explained that, quote, the appearance of Russian troops near Kiev and in other cities of Ukraine is not connected with the intention to occupy the country. We don't have that goal, unquote. And Lavrov added, quote, our goal doesn't include regime change in Ukraine. This is an American specialty, unquote. Since the changing goals made the operation progressively more confusing, Putin spokesperson Peskov explained in the fall 2022, the goals of the military operation can be achieved in different ways and may take different formats. Unquote. In October 2022, the moderator of the Valdai Forum asked Putin, Vladimir Vladimirovich, you have repeatedly said that the special military operation is going according to plan, but the Russian society is confused about the plan. Can you explain it, please? Putin replied by changing the goal once again, instead of clarifying. He said, it was in fact, the goal was about, quote, the historical territories of Russia known as Novorossiya that were inside Ukraine and went far beyond Donbass. The southern and eastern territories of Ukraine belonged to Russia. Quote, when it became obvious to the people that the people living there see their future together with Russia, how could we not respond to them, unquote. But at the forum, Putin also added something different. Although the immediate goals of the military operation may have changed over time, he said, one fundamental objective, in the meantime, let's say, always remained the same. It was to end the Western and especially American world domination. By April 2023, as part of this shift and in the context of international sanctions and military support of Ukraine, the goals of the war were retroactively explained in new terms. In the new doctrine or concept of Russian federal policy that was adopted that spring, Russia was defined as a unique state civilization. The term civilization was also used in previous years, but then it was used to call for cooperation between major civilizations of the world, including Russia and the West. But the new 2023 doctrine claimed, on the contrary, that some civilizations were not only distinct and self-sufficient, but also incommensurable with others. They develop according to their own unique internal laws and relate to others like different species of animals relate to each other. Cooperation between such civilizations is of limited use, and the main way to avoid conflict is to limit interaction. The journal Russia in Global Affairs, which is very close to Kremlin, wrote, I'm quoting, if earlier the priority for Russia was to become a member of the civilized world, that is, Western civilization, now Russia has realized and accepted its status as a state civilization, and it seeks to emphasize its own unique identity. Russia's European journey has lasted for 3 centuries. That lasted for 3 centuries is finally over. For a very long time, Russian civilization, like a genie, was locked in a bottle that was corked with a stopper of Western centrism. But now the cork has been pulled out, and Russian civilization has finally broken free, unquote. Putin mused at the Valdai 2023, quote, there are many civilizations in the world, but what makes a state civilization unique, in my opinion, is its diversity and self-sufficiency. Any unification is alien to the modern world. Unique civilizational states want to work out their own path or development independently. On the one hand, of course, the claim to be a unique state civilization is part of a global trend. In recent years, as we know, China, India, Turkey, among others, have articulated similar claims. The civilizational model allows autocrats to employ a semblance of anti-colonial rhetoric to present various universal values, such as those of human rights, feminism, LGBTQ rights, ethnic minority rights, environmental movement, and so on, as a form of colonialism that Western civilization tries to impose on them. This approach justifies the need for a strong authoritarian state. Another feature of civilizational states is that unlike nation states, they claim not to be confined to strict territorial and international borders, territories and international borders. At Valdai 2023 forum, for example, Putin explained that although the operation in Ukraine involved occupying and annexing territories, I'm quoting, this is not a territorial conflict. Russia is the largest country in the world by territory, so we have no interest in conquering additional territories. We must still explore Siberia, Eastern Siberia, the Far East. The issue is much broader than territory. He later explained what he meant by this much broader issue. Again, quoting, Russia as a state civilization has no borders, just as other civilizations have no borders. And at the same time, every civilization is indivisible. While the Russian civilization cannot be reduced to one common denominator, it cannot be divided either. It exists only in its integrity as one spiritual and cultural whole, unquote. Here, civilizations are described in kind of quasi-biological terms as biological organisms that evolved slowly for many centuries in a process that Putin calls, quote, a long and complex synthesis. The result is a completely unique, indivisible, and stable civilizational body. At the core of this unique body is a strong state which grows naturally from the civilizational roots of countries and people, and which cannot be imposed from the outside, unquote. Every person is naturally rooted in this or that civilizational whole, and is the bearer of its, quote, civilizational code. As Putin puts it again, quote, you cannot betray your civilization, just as you cannot betray your nature. If you do, he says, this is unnatural and disgusting, unquote. Pushing the metaphor of biological species further, Putin added at Valdai 2023, quote, it is important to protect the civilizational diversity of our planet, just as it is important to protect the biological and ecological diversity. Following this doctrine, the goal of the operation in Ukraine was changed again. It was to overcome the unnatural fragmentation of the Russian civilization. As Putin said, quote, the main goal is to refuse the artificial division into Ukrainians and Russians, unquote. Putin's use of the quasi-biological arguments draws on much previous nationalist thought, of course, starting with the 18th century writings of Johann Gottfried Herder on national character and national spirit. However, in Putin's rhetoric, character and spirit are replaced with civilizational roots and civilizational codes, which makes them far less malleable historically and far more focused on the immutable, strong state. With the adoption of the doctrine, a new mandatory program for colleges was introduced with the title The DNA of Russia. Metaphorical, but not quite, if you look at the logo. The double-headed dove with the DNA of Russia for its legs. Um, in September 2023, all students, regardless of their majors, all college students, started taking courses in this program. One course is titled The Civilizational Code of Russian History. Its central ideas are Russia is its own unique civilization, and at the center of the civilization is a strong state that unites it. Russian civilization is based on three fundamental values: duty, sovereignty, and blessing, or grace, whatever. And such foreign values as tolerance are critiqued because they promote destructive indifference. So this aggressive civilizationism can be seen as a neo-imperialist project, but it is also more than that. By rejecting the universality of human values and rights, this project rejects a common basis of humanity. Its claim for a radical quasi-biological uniqueness is another way of claiming the priority and superiority of one's own nature or civilizational DNA. This doesn't only allow it to justify any state violence internally and any aggression externally, but also makes this project remarkably close to the classical forms of fascism.
Thank you. I will actually come back to the more general explanations and gently argue with some of points introduced by Dima. I will say not gently, but comradely. So basically, why we are talking about fascism today? And can we talk about the fascism today in its new forms, in a new historical situation? Or let's say, can we talk about post-fascism according to Enzo Traverso definition? So I think that in order to answer this question, we need to look in the basic definitions of fascism. So what fascism is not? The first thing that the fascism is not a coherent ideology, and it never was a coherent ideology. So the fascist declaration will not constitute a coherent whole, but rather consist of an arbitrary set of slogans addressed to various social groups. It was more technology of dominance, according to Karl Polanyi, than some exact doctrine. But of course, we can define some elements, key elements of the fascist way of thinking, as, for example, was explained by Alexei Yurchak in his previous talk. So fascism, and that is much more controversial point, is not just a movement, because the idea that the fascism is a sort of mass movement from below that emerged in the situation of the direct conflict, direct threat from the revolutionary movement, and somehow overthrow the state machinery is very kind of popular understanding of fascism. But it's important to know that historically fascism was a product of exact historical situation, and that historical situation, let's say the first half of the 20th century, was the situation of was the age of mass movements in general. So the fascism as mass movement took a form of its enemy, let's say, and choose various elements of the form of its enemy. So now we are not living in the age of mass movements in general. So it's hard to imagine such type of mass movement as it was in the first half of the 20th century. And also we can even say that the character of these mass movements, even in the age of the historical fascism, were quite different. But what was common the common thing was that all these movements were able to come to power when they were allowed to come to power by the traditional elites of the state. And then they transform the state from the top. And I think that this idea of fascism, fascism as the regime, which resulted from the will of the ruling elites, to transform not just the political state, but the society and the whole in some exact manner. And I think that this is the most important element of fascism. And we know that even in the age of the historical fascism, the mass fascist movements in the countries where the old elites didn't need them to answer the crisis, they were not able to seize the power. And in the countries where they seized the power, it happened through the traditional political institutions, such as elections, parliament, and so on. So we never ever saw a real, let's say, fascist revolution where the fascists took power in the revolutionary manner with the break of the old state machinery. And what we see now with all the differences is the same kind of the move of the elites in various countries, in various situations, to some sort of the fascist solutions. And I think it was perfectly explained by Blanca in her talk. This kind of adaptation of some elements of the far-right program by the current, let's say, political elite, this kind of merging between the far-right and the ruling political elite. And of course, in US, we see the process where the main old party of the elite is kind of taken over by semi-fascist, far-right forces, which dub the very foundations of the democratic, political institution in this country. And that is a totally different situation. And it looked like not a kind of anti-system mass movement coming out of the, let's say, state elite, ruling class, and so on, but rather the transformation of the at least part of the existed ruling class in the fascist direction. So the next question is what the fascist regime look like? What is the fascist project is about? So the first thing, that is the transformation of the state from the top as a response to the crisis, to the economic crisis, to the crisis of the previous forms of domination, to the crisis of representative democracy, and so on. Then, and that is the key element of the fascist regime, suppression of all forms of the self-organization in the society. Is not only about the revolutionary movements. It's about all elements of the social self-organization, including unions, various social movements. So it's the program of the total atomization of the society in order to rule it directly without any kind of political mediation, without any political institutions in between the society and the ruling elite, and that is very different, but somehow related, but different from Bonapartism. Because what is Bonapartism? Bonapartism is the is a form of restraining of the class conflict in the society by the state. So the state come as a mediator or oppressor, suppressor of various class conflicts in the society. And as it was explained by Marx in 18 Brumaire, it politically expropriate all the social classes, including bourgeoisie. So the state, in its Bonapartist form, acted in the general interest, let's say, of the bourgeoisie, but without the bourgeoisie playing some independent political role. Basically, Bonapartism is something that presents itself as the classless, people's sort of power, which represents all the layers of the society without any direct political, participation of these elements in the political process. And in this sense, Bonapartism and this Bonapartist tendency of the state is very much inherited in or rooted in the bourgeois state as such. And even young Marx and his essay on Jewish question, he explained that that is the basic kind of contradiction of the liberal democracy of the bourgeois state, that the individual freedom, the negative freedom, the freedom from others became a general freedom, and the political freedom became something empty, something not really important. So the main tendency of the bourgeois state, according to Marx, basically is the permanent devaluation of the political participants among the people, among the society. Fascism, and another important thing about Bonapartism is that Bonapartism has no, or Caesarism, according to Gramsci, is the empty, it's an empty form. So it's pure form of balance, the pure form of equilibrium between the various social classes in the country, and it has no its own mission. It has no its own kind of political project. But the project of fascism is much more ambitious and much more essential, because the aim of fascism is to change the society as such, to destroy all the elements of political participation and the notion of the common interest, the interests of the society as such. So basically, the idea of corporative state, which is very historically close to fascism, look at worker or the owner of the enterprise as the kind of details, some elements embedded by the enterprise as such. So the enterprise as such exists as the unit, together with all kind of people on the different positions incorporated in the capitalist enterprise. And the other important moment is about democracy. Is about democracy and the point that fascism is a sort of authoritarian democracy. It's of course it's very interesting point to discuss, but in fact the idea that the essence of democracy is dictatorship, this idea proposed by Carl Schmitt, was established in order to show that by Schmitt that there is always a kind of conflict between the representation and democracy. That representative democracy is not true democracy, so the real kind of essence of democracy is to overcome any sort of political representation, and the true kind of final realization of the general will, like he interpret in this way the Rousseau's notion of the general will is a dictatorship. So it's important that for Schmitt, the dictatorship is not something that is imminent to the development of the democracies is such, but always present a sort of exception. And the fascist term is always about exception, is always about the refusal of the norm. It's against all the sorts of representation, any sorts of the norm, and it's not about, according to Schmitt, how to decide according some norm, but who is this? Who is making a decision? And it means that the fascist project basically overcome any idea of the legal equality, of the legal political equality. There is no any place for the honest competition between the weak and the poor, how it exists in the moderated market economy, or how it exists in the representative liberal democracy. It always about who is the sovereign, who is making decision. And in this sense, there is the basic contradiction between the capitalism and democracy as such, because democracy, I mean democracy in general terms, not just in the terms of political institutions, but democracy as some kind of movement for equality. Movement for equality, which historically was started as a movement for political rights and then turned to the social rights. So the potential of any political democracy is to question the lack of democracy in the social life and economy and so on. So the historical aim of fascism always was to eliminate democracy as this tendency, as this potential of the society to manage the economy. And in this sense, we can say that the final goal of the fascism as the political project is the fusion between the capital and the state. So you can say in opposite that the fascist state is the existence of the capital in the form of the state. And that was very much explained by Franz Neumann in his famous book on German national socialism. So probably the last point will be about Putin's Russia. I don't want to go too much into it, but definitely in the case of Russia, we see how this move, this fascist move, this fascist storm from the top happened after the beginning of the war, and the war for this regime is not only question of the foreign policy, but it's also a question of transformation of its own society. So, as Alexei explained, that according to Putin, there is no borders between civilizations. In the same way, there is no borders between the foreign policy and domestic policy. So the foreign policy exists for fascist regimes, and we know it with the example of Nazi Germany, for instance, that the external aggression always comes as the continuation of internal aggression, of internal extermination of minorities, and so on. So the conceptualization of the Second World War, according to Hitler, was that it is basically the final battle between the two races, the Jewish race and the Aryan race. And the exact place of exact international players, agents, doesn't matter too much, because they're just elements of the this kind of big war, big conflict, which is happening inside the country as well as outside. And this role of the war in this kind of turn to the fascists, we can see in Putin's Russia clearly, because if it is struggling against the Western domination, against the liberal whatever values, against the liberal elites. So it means that this war is also continuing at home. That is also directed against the conscious and unconscious agents of these elites and of this false values, of these aliens to our DNA, to our unique civilization that still exists inside the country. So the final project of fascism is to create a sort of homogeneous society, and of course it definitely needs some time. It needs some work to do to transform the society in this direction. And we know that even for the time of the existence of the Nazi regime in Germany, even this process was unfinished. So we can say that the Nazi Germany became the full Nazi society. So that's why we have this process of fascization in Russia, this process of transformation of the society in the direction of the atomization, in the direction of the destruction of all the forms of self-organization, and this process is still unfinished. Thank you.
We have some time for a little bit of discussion between our panelists, and then we'll open it up to the audience for Q&A shortly. Perhaps I could just, I promise, kick us off with an invitation for the panelists to reflect on the question of the future, pushing off from Alexei's description of the Putin regime as profoundly or foundationally reactive. And with the slide in the back, I think this is the Military Forces Cathedral, built in Moscow, with its revivalist Neo-Byzantine aesthetics, right? Just a few years ago, and also ripping off of this idea of the time that fascism or regime might require to change society. So I wanted to invite you to reflect or speak to the idea of the future in two distinct senses. First, the role of the future or lack thereof in these movements or regimes, self-conceptions and self-images. Clearly, all of them are attracted or attached to some idea of the past or tradition, whether in terms of particularism, political tradition, civilizational, perhaps also the idea of old state machinery as legitimizing or allowing, naturalizing these movements. And of course, the idea of nationalism. So I wanted to ask you about their conception of the future, and maybe even actually of temporality as such, progressive or cyclical. And in the second distinct sense, and the full understanding that this might be an impossible question to answer. I wanted to ask you to reflect on how you see the future of these regimes and movements in our contemporary moment and moving forward. So, thank you, and I'm going to pass this mic around.
Okay, I guess I would just say that so first of all, speaking about historical fascisms briefly, I think there is a real question about the role of the future in fascist ideology. I think it's clearest in the writings of Giovanni Gentile, who is probably the most radical denial in certain ways of the idea of a project with his doctrine of immanentism, which is the idea that truth is kind of immediate, and there's a kind of obsession with immediacy, which is particular, I would say, to historical fascism. In terms of the role of the future, you know, in sort of what's going on in the contemporary period, I mean, I think it would be hard to argue with the fact that, in a sense, not only is there an exhaustion of the utopian alternatives of the 20th century, but of course, neoliberalism itself is not really, in many respects, a future-oriented doctrine. It never really has been, and it particularly doesn't, in my view, it does not offer, in a sense, it doesn't offer a social vision, at least in the way you would think about what a social vision meant in the great 20th century ideologies. I'm kind of testing this out. I haven't really thought about this, but it strikes me that it has that neoliberalism as an ideology has a very different structure from the classical utopias, even kind of, if you could think about reactionary utopias of the 20th century. So I think there's a crisis. You know, I would say there's a crisis of the future and all these kind of things. But let me see what others have to say.
I think the way I would think about this is to go back to what I started with in my presentation, which was that unlike the it's quite common in some forms of liberal media to think about Putin as trying to rethink or reconstruct some kind of Soviet project, and it's like he's doing anything but. He hates the Soviet Union. He hates the whole idea of this future-oriented radical transformation of humanity, of society. He hates Lenin. And the reason he does is that he says that Ukraine, which is an artificial construct, was actually created by Lenin, who did two bad things. First of all, he created a big independent republic within the Soviet Union by giving it land from what Putin claims to be historical Russia in the south. And second, Lenin put into the constitution in 1922, when the Soviet Union was created 5 years after the revolution, the idea that each republic has the right to secede. It wasn't, of course, possible in practice. If you did, you would be accused of being a nationalist and shot. But when the Soviet Union was disintegrating in 1991, that article in the constitution was exercised by every republic, and they disintegrated and they went in their separate ways. So I just wanted to show what Putin says about, and yeah, so let me just very quickly, before I read this, say that for Lenin and for this whole Soviet project, future, of course, was the horizon. It was a very future-oriented project, very future-oriented ideology, very future-oriented practical decisions on every step of the way. And for Putin, it's the opposite. All of these ideas of the DNA, right, which they now use only half metaphorically, but even before, it's always based on the idea that there was some kind of abstract past when the real it was formed. And since then, this Russian civilization, Russian culture, whatever, some unique state, it travels through history almost unchanged since then. And so all the heroes are always in the past. But it's interesting that, so he would say that Lenin was the author and architect of Ukraine. I'm reading today it can rightfully be called Ukraine, can rightfully be called the Ukraine of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. He's been funny, right? And then he says Lenin is to blame for the collapse of the USSR by granting the republics the right to secede and so forth, right? He put like the ball under this state. And then but it's interesting that today Russian troops on the occupied territories of Ukraine actually re-erect monuments to Lenin, clearly by following the orders coming from the Kremlin. Those monuments to Lenin, which the Ukrainians toppled before. You've heard about this big movement in Ukraine to topple the monuments because they stood for the empire. And so all these empty pedestals, and Russian troops enter some town, there's always going to be a pedestal where Lenin used to be. They either find Lenin, if the statue wasn't destroyed, or they bring another one and pull it up. So what is going on? It's kind of like a paradox. He hates Lenin, but no. Well, the reason is that actually, and I'm trying to explain it here. So Lenin is both good and bad. Lenin is bad as this symbol of the future, a symbol of radical rupture with that imperial state, and a radical transformation of and creation of something very different, looking about the future. But Lenin is good because he can be mobilized as a figure, just like Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, Stalin, and all these Orthodox saints, as the figure who stands for this past, for the imperial state, for the state which the Soviet Union was just a little big one, was just one incarnation of many of that completely unchanging ahistorical state which Putin identifies with, and which is very fast-oriented. So Lenin is being completely reinterpreted, which is why it's possible on one hand to really criticize him in every speech he does it. On the other hand, to put up the monuments to him. So that what I would say the relationship of Putin's state to the future is always in relation to what happened with the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I mean, this question of the future is challenging because usually the temporality of the far right is that of the restoration, the return to the past is a cyclical time. I do think that what Dylan said about the example of Italian fascism, of the immanentism living in the present, it's something that might be true of these far-right ideologies in the decaying old empires, in the sense that I think the sense of temporality is linked to the sense of territoriality, right? And so there is something of a paradox of these ideologies, which is the refusal of the expansion, right? Both in Italy, if you listen to Meloni speak, if you listen to Abascal speak in Spain, or to Le Pen, or even to Zemmour, they want to go back to France, they want to go back to their land, they want to be in the here and now. And Trump says a little bit the same. Why are we spending the money, right? And I think the reason why there is no future with them is that they refuse to acknowledge the ecological crisis, right? It's not only that they have no political economy. I mean, that has been a feature of the far right. They never had really an economic plan as how they're being attacked. They have no answers about when if you're in power, what are you going to do? But also they are against any ecological discourse. They are against taking into account the climate disaster. They are in the state of infantile refusal, the negation that there is a radical change in time for the human species. But I think that maybe with the fascist and far-right movements that are emerging in non-imperialist, old imperialist countries, and I'm thinking of like I like your presentation, Alexei, you included India, you included China, and if we think of Argentina today with Milei, I think in these countries there is maybe the sense of finally being able to realize the brittle potential of this great nation, right? That this is our turn in history. It is our turn to now become that. And then there is a future there. There is a future there to mobilize, to realize this state civilization, which that cannot be sold in any way to the old empires that are receding in time, they're receding in space, and so they're looking inwards. And also then refusing to even acknowledge or take on the question. So that would be one way I could think about that.
Yeah, so I will agree with the point that the fascism is origin is not utopian, like in general, because it always based not just on the some return to the past, but on the pure present. And then the like essential ideology of fascism is the ideology of the market, which should be transplanted to the all spheres of life. And what is the main law of the market? Is the aim to dominate? Is the aim to gain over the weaker? And that considered by fascism as something that already inherited in the human beings, like biologically. Yeah, so that is how it was called by the director of Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. He said that empire is in our blood. It's our blood. It's not just some utopian vision. And the aim of fascism is not to give some new like vision of the future, but like to activate something that is already there, that is identical to our true like nature, which was always oppressed by humanism, democracy, socialism, and all these kind of things. So you need to get rid of all this artificial, restrictions to impose your what you really are. And that is not just about the individuals, it's about the nations and it's about the countries. So the very, let's say, political idea of imperialism is that the expansion is the nature, it's the essence of the state. So the state has to expand, and that is how the states are, living in the universe, how they live in history, and so on. And I think that here we can see this direct relation between the fascist ideology and the market ideology. Ideology not in the sense of some established doctrine, but ideology as the real practice.
I think we should now open this up for Q&A. I see depends, and I'm sorry we don't have a traveling mic, so if you could project.
Thank you very much. I was wondering, this is especially relevant to Alexei's argument about the civilization of the state, but could be a point of reflection in general about the changes, the differences perhaps in the newer manifestations of fascism versus the 1920s, 30s, earlier iterations, and that has to do with religion. I mean, what's striking in at least three of the cases presented in your representations, and certainly say in Sam Huntington's idea in The Clash of Civilizations about what sort of is the glue of these civilizational aspirations of recent politics, is religious identity as a component of ethno-nationalism. In the historical iterations in real, I would say, fascist regimes, relations, especially with religious institutions, I'm thinking about Mussolini and the Vatican, were often quite uneasy, especially in the early stages. But in the image, which was quite striking, that was presented of the Orthodox Church in the Russian case, and certainly in some of the pronouncements of Putin, and in French ethno-nationalism, religious difference really is a critical chisura in what's going on in these authoritarian movements. The slide you showed, Alexei, with neo-Ottomanism, I mean, clearly religious identity in Turkey, in Modi's India, and then sort of the neo-Confucian imagery you showed is quite striking, and even some of the gestures that Putin has made towards the Orthodox Church against that?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. I think what is really striking in Huntington's definitions of civilizations and their religious identities is that it's a kind of what was called theocracy, the multiplicity of gods. There is no one universal God in his view of the world, but there are at least 8 or 9 different gods, and each of its god belong to exact civilization. So it's very kind of deep reject of the universalist essence of Christianity, for example, in this civilizational approach, and which is definitely very close to what we are talking about with fascism, with identity, with let's say this sort of materiality of the fascism, its orientations toward the body, the blood, something that is real. And another important thing about Putin and the place of the Orthodox religion, that his understanding of religion is could be comparable with Louis Althusser's explanation of ideology, because for him the main thing is the practice. So how effective it is. And once there was a movie about Putin, like 2 hours in Russian TV, 2 hours, Putin visiting one of the oldest monasteries in the north of Russia, Volam, and he said that, well, if you look at the communist moral code of the builder of communism, yeah, the very famous Soviet kind of moral credo of the true Soviet citizen, and you compare it with what is Orthodox Christianity is saying, you can find that they are nearly equal. That is Putin's explanation. But why the communists they established some sort of new religion or new moral code when they already had Orthodox religion, which effectiveness was proven by the centuries of the Russian history. So in the competition between the communism and Orthodox religion is definitely much more effective. It's better because it worked for I don't know 1,000 years, and the communist ideology was not able to save the Russian state during the 70 years. So that's why we should turn to the Orthodox religion as the most competitive, let's say, is proven in the very hard historical competition. So that his understanding of religion, and that the understanding of Orthodox religion by the Russian state, which is sort of moral, which attribute to the force. You know, if you want to be strong against the others, you need to have a high morality, high spirit. Yeah. So this sort of high morality is provided by Russian Orthodox Church as the national religions of Russians, but not of anyone else.
I think this question of the role of religion is really important. It is a key component of ethno-nationalism, and when it was resuscitated in the 90s in France, of course, was the idea that French is a European civilization, the European civilization are Christian civilizations, and then, you know, therefore, Islam and other religions have no real room, should not be associated to France. Now, I do wonder if this is really about religion, because it's not like the practice of religion, right? Or Catholicism or Christianism is increasing, or is even a thing that these groups do. I do think, at least in the case of France, religion here is mobilized as a marker of race, right? It is there to racialize bodies, to produce a racial differentiation between the Conseil de Souche, which is white, the original French, and the racialized body. because you do have a lot of Arabs that have other religions, other rather folks from West Africa have different religions. So I do think this polarization is about racialization, and I think one of the strange specificities of in France is like the state itself, which supposedly is a secular state, is also racializing its citizens using religion. It's reproducing this marker. It began with the banning of the veil, right, in the schools. Then it was the banning of the burqa in the public space, and we thought we were done with that, but it was very necessary for the Macron government, for the Minister of Education, to ban the abayas in the school, because some of the markers had been erased, so they had to be reinforced once again to make sure that to be French and to be part of a citizen in French means that you need to reject publicly, in a visible way, any affiliation to the Islamic religion and all of this discourse that Islam is incompatible with the French Republic. I mean, the other religions can be assimilated, but not that particular one, which is, of course, about the colonial history of France, and particularly North Africa, West Africa, yeah.
Yeah, this is a very important question. Thank you, Marianne. I agree with what was already said. Just add a couple of things. There's something to be said about Russia which is specific. There are 4 official religions. So even though Christian Orthodoxy is kind of the presiding one, there's also Islam, Judaism, and Buddhism, and Buddhism constantly meets with those 4 heads of churches, not churches in the case of Buddhism, heads of religions. And it's always televised, and he doesn't only go to Balaam and the Christian monasteries, he sometimes goes also to their sites, Muslim sites and Buddhist sites. So that is kind of the performative aspect of it. But not so much, but recently he did go to the Buddhist one just a few months ago. But another interesting thing about civilizations, because you also mentioned Huntington, and Ilya actually has a very interesting piece, which I recommend, where called something like Putin is a good reader of Huntington.
It's called Putin Lives on the Wall. That
Huntington Bill. It's in that book, Dissidents Against Dissidents, which you mentioned, which we published with Versa, and there's a chapter there. But it's interesting because Putin, indeed, like a lot of these autocrats, like in the case of Modi, they to some extent, you can say, replicate this kind of somewhat simplistic civilizational analysis which Huntington presents, and in a way they are using it as good students for their own purposes. And of course, that was also the case with Putin when he always talked about the conversation with the Western civilization, which Russia needs to be at the same table, or equal rights and so forth. But that changed since the war began. Now that they have incorporated this new discourse of states, unique state civilization with a dash, it's actually from a different genealogy than Huntington. And they now talk, like the way I didn't have time to quote Putin, but he doesn't talk about the West as a civilization. It's almost like an anti-civilization. It's this anti-civilizational force which deconstructs human nature with all this, same-sex marriages and abortions and so forth. So in a way, this is very much a non-Huntington world. It's not about clash of different civilizations. It's all civilizations of humanity against this anti-civilizational force which the West represents. And that's a new kind of argument. And it's really quite dominant.
Thank you. Ilya, I found your presentation really interesting. I appreciate it. I think I basically agree with it, but I have a question, which is that I appreciated your invocation on the Jewish question and this loss of mediation, right? In some ways, I think we can even think of modernity in this way. I mean, like even going back as far as like Luther, Hobbes, Locke, Descartes, different ways that mediation sort of breaks down, leading to Marx, not only on the Jewish question, but also commodity fetishism, right? That the relationship between the image and reality is sort of immediate in a way. And so that, you talk about like social Darwinism and the logic of the market. And so there's this kind of, this like loss of negation. And so like so what I took you to be saying was that actually fascism in certain ways takes these problems of representation and of negation, social institutions, forms of mediation, right? Both in politics and in capitalist relations, and sort of intensifies them in a certain way. And so you get an even more extreme form of like Manichaeism, but even then there's some symbols, right? Like there's no mediation in the flag or in the song. There are forms of scapegoating. There's no real explanation. As has been said by several people, fascism doesn't have like a logical coherence or consistency in its ideology and so on and so forth. So there are these ways that this lack of mediation that happens over the course of modernity and gets intensified in fascism also produces this kind of incoherence, right? Okay, so this is all to say that, I think Dylan has a point, right? Because in the early 20th century, and I know you sort of addressed this in a certain way, but I just want to push you a little bit to try to answer this question, because in the early 20th century, of course, like we have these communist movements, and the response to that then is like scapegoating, right? There are all these like right-wing newspapers, publication of the protocols, and so on and so forth. And so the weird thing is that I agree, like we don't have these big communist attempted revolutions, and yet there's plenty of scapegoating, right? Like billionaires are losing plenty of money on YouTube channels to scapegoat a different vulnerable minority every week, and so on and so forth. There was a lot that was written, a decade ago or something about inequality, and there have been attempts to have like a global wealth tax and so on and so forth. But is this sufficient? I just wonder how you would see the response to a crisis and the scapegoating that is appearing like all over the place now. I mean, I take your basic premises, but I wonder how you would explain what kind of crisis or what is being responded to that's leading to the mobilization on the far right that we're seeing.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very rich question. There are 10 different questions in one, so I'm not sure if I will able to respond to all of it. But I will focus on the question of fear. So this kind of understanding of some danger, of some threat coming from somewhere and challenging the power of the ruling classes, of the dominating elite, it's not always been rational. So, for example, you can say that in Germany in the early 30s, it was the direct danger of the communist revolution. But it was for sure the feeling of threat among the ruling elites that allowed them to invite, fascists to government and so on. And definitely, Putin, for example, he sees this war as the existential for his regime in general. And when he started it, and he said that we had no other option, we have to respond on something which is not here, which is not visible, but which somehow already presented as a threat. So I think that we should talk about the current turn towards the fascization in the case of Russia and in other very kind of unique, very different situations in terms of this kind of combination of the, let's say, objective and subjective danger, objective and subjective threat for that are felt by the current elites. I don't want to go too much into this, but I think it's very important.
Really briefly done, and I'm wondering, if you wanted to respond to this question as well, or
I'm just going to say very briefly, I think this is I think this was particularly clear in Blanca's presentation. I do think it's very important to understand that we are living in a moment in which the problem that is generating whatever we want to call this, if we want to call it neo-fascism, it has to do actually with the collapse of any alternative on the left, which is in total and utter contrast to the situation of the 20s and 30s. And I do think that's a point that we ought to hold firmly in our minds as we try to understand the current situation.
I mean, the only thing I want to say in response to this idea of fascism as a lack of negation or mediation as is often to immediacy, which is what fascism is good at, right? And negating that, is that when a far-right party like the Front National is forced to compete for elections over and over and is to put arguments and is to present an electoral program, it is projecting itself in a representational system, right? And that is also eroding its power, right? Like fascists are not good at being in debates in the public space and convincing people, like getting like back and forth, the exchange of arguments. That's not where they excel. They excel in other domains. And so I think what happened is that when they get trapped into the system and they need to give answers, they need to present a program, etc., they end up having to then adapt and borrow from also establishment parties, and so they begin to become establishment parties. So there is a tension there that I think is interesting for us.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit. I know it's a bit late. In response, in addition to the response which Ilya gave, I think I kind of alluded to this in the beginning of my talk, that the explanation of what's the reason for the war, what's the reason for that attack, which was so surprising and unexpected, was constantly changing. And it's important, maybe I didn't quite emphasize it enough, it's important to say that it wasn't simply difficult to articulate it clearly, or maybe there are many different reasons and they switched. It was important that there was no reason. They couldn't really articulate, and then they actually wanted to make it clear that it doesn't matter what the reason is. The reason is to start this war because there is this general threat, but also, as Ilya was saying in his presentation, as a means of reproducing the regime and making it much stronger. So in a way, it didn't matter what the reason is. And in fact, if you don't have a very clear understanding of what it is, it's even better.
Again, I just wanted to